500 years ago, a powerful people called the Incas ruled over the largest empire in all the Americas. Then, Spanish conquistadors invaded, discovering the magnificent riches and splendor of the Incas, as well as a bizarre cult of death.
I know of no other major society in which the dead were actually kept with the living and treated as if they were still alive.
They were seen as living beings that had to be tended for, that had to be dressed every day, that had to be fed. They had to go to the bathroom. They had to have sex.
The Incas held lavish banquets for their mummified ancestors, where corpses were dressed in fine clothes and exquisite jewelry, and offered the choicest food and drink. Loyal subjects held conversations with the mummies of deceased emperors, seeking advice and guidance from them. In their mountainous world where land was scarce, why did the Incas give their mummies vast estates, where hundreds of laborers toiled to grow food for the dead? Join us as we travel to the high Andes and transcend the centuries to enter the domain of the most mysterious death cult the world has ever known. It is the year 1532, a time of tragedy and sorrow in the ancient land of Peru. The mighty Inca Empire has been vanquished by a tiny band of ruthless adventurers from across the sea. Once the powerful lords of their mountainous domain, the proud Inca people now toil under the bitter yoke of new masters from Spain. The leader of the Spaniards, Francisco Pizarro, makes his triumphant entry into the Inca capital, the holy city of Cusco. As he establishes his rule, Pizarro decides to reward an Indian ally who wishes to wed an Inca princess. He sends his cousin Pedro to ask the patriarch of the young woman's family to approve the marriage. It is a mission that Pedro Pizarro will never forget. Believing that he will be taken to meet the living head of the household, Pizarro is shocked at what he finds. He discovers that the patriarch, who has the power to govern the entire family's affairs, is a shriveled, mummified corpse. In stunned fascination, the Spaniard waits for those who attend the mummy to announce its decision. After some time, he's informed that the dead patriarch has given his permission. The marriage may take place. The conquering Spaniards are horrified at the power that the dead command over the Incas. Coming to Peru in search of gold and riches, the conquistadors have stumbled upon an eerie death cult, centuries old. For here in the land of the Incas, the living and the dead share one of history's most bizarre relationships. The living treat the deceased as though they have not died, laboring for them, eating and drinking with them, even building them splendid palaces and granting them vast estates. The living believe that in return, the dead will guarantee their survival. After witnessing this cult of death, one awestruck Spaniard would write that such unfathomable rites existed among the Incas that only God could comprehend them. But the Incas were not alone. At the dawn of human history, in far-flung parts of the world, other civilizations once worshipped the dead. About 3,000 years before the birth of Jesus, the Egyptians conceived a cult of immortality, developing their secret art of preserving human bodies for eternity. Yet even at the time of the pharaohs, Peruvians in South America had already been mummifying their dead for nearly 4,000 years.
Ancient Peru has the world's oldest mummies. We know that mummification began in Chile 7,000 BC. Long before the Egyptians, we know that a simple fishing people, the Chinchorro on the coast of Chile, were mummifying ordinary people in the community, and they were bringing them gifts of food and drink as if they were still alive.
What made Peru the birthplace of mummification? In addition to its hot, dry climate, its towering mountains may have provided ideal conditions for preserving the dead.
The idea of the mummy probably came from the fact that mummies were accidentally formed by burying people in high and very dry places where they were essentially freeze-dried. And from this came the notion that the body could be preserved indefinitely.
Peru's worship of ancestors was not only far older than Egypt's, it surpassed anything practiced anywhere else in the ancient world. The Egyptians believed that after death, souls journeyed to a faraway land beyond the setting sun. But in Peruvian belief, the dead never left the world of the living.
I know of no other major society in which the dead were actually kept with the living and treated as if they were still alive. This person he wasn't ceasing to live. He was just transformed into a more stable state, if you will. And that was a good thing from their point of view, not something to be afraid of or horrified by.
Initially, the worship of the dead was a simple family affair, performed in isolated farming villages. But as Peruvian civilization developed, so too did its cult of the dead. Why did it become such a widespread and elaborate ritual? Many have long pondered ancient Peru's strange religious rituals of mummy worship. How did they originate, and why? The answers are elusive, but one intriguing site provides clues to the possible evolution of the cult. Deep within the southern Andes, not far from the modern city of Cusco, lies a valley situated 11,000 feet above sea level. Archaeologists have discovered that it is strewn with strange, massive constructions of rock. They are the remains of enormous buildings built over 1,000 years ago, structures whose original purpose has long been forgotten. Today, local people call this place Piquillacta. Archaeologists regard it as one of Peru's most baffling ancient mysteries.
Piquillacta was totally an enigma. There were no surface artifacts suggesting what it might have been. All we knew was that it was very large and impressive. We have some rough calculations that indicate to us that we're looking at more than 9 million man-days just to build the central portion alone. Therefore, an enormous economic investment in terms of providing for that labor, feeding them, etc.
For centuries, Piquillacta's purpose was shrouded in obscurity. But in this small building, its secrets may at last have been revealed.
As we began excavating, we uncovered this wall containing a row of large niches. This captured our attention because large niches are usually associated with temple structures in ancient Peru. We don't know exactly what would have been in them, but we suppose that they might have contained images of ancestors.
Further digging uncovered gruesome artifacts. Human remains purposely concealed within some of Piquillacta's walls, and mysterious pits containing llama bones and other offerings, all of which suggested ancestor worship. In the 1920s, exquisite human figurines were found in similar offering pits. Scholars were mystified. Could these have been the faces of sacred ancestors? Could Piquillacta have been a center for worshipping the dead? Perhaps it had an even stranger purpose. The Wari were a militant people. Some believed that in order to guarantee the allegiance of those they had conquered, they may have held the mummified ancestors of the defeated as hostages.
In holding them hostage, we're not talking about a situation of putting them in prison and making them miserable. We bring them to very fine temples that we control. We allow the members of their lineage who are living to come in and worship them and to commune with them. But there's always the implied threat that if you do not cooperate, something terrible could happen to your lineage ancestor, who is now a mummy. We believe it was a mechanism used by the Wari to control large numbers of people in a very economical way in terms of not needing huge amounts of soldiers to come in and force people to cooperate.
In ancient Peru, the secret of empire may have been this: he who would control the living must first control the dead. But why were the living so afraid to lose their dead? What terrible power did the deceased wield over them? Clues emerged at a nearby site called Chocapuquio, where archaeologists came upon a grim discovery.
When we began excavating in front of these tombs, we discovered that the bodies that had been in them were laying in the dirt directly in front, as if they had just been yanked out of the tomb and left on the ground. And in addition, we found artifacts that suggested these were important people. We found a woman's topo pin, which is a shawl pin made of silver. This is not something that would be owned by your run-of-the-mill Andean person. This is not a modern looting pattern, and suggests to us that it was done perhaps in ancient times by people who were not interested in robbing the bodies. They were interested in defiling them.
Why were the sacred dead of Chocapuquio so savagely desecrated? Perhaps their destruction was meant to punish the living.
Removing their ancestors and destroying their places of worship of their ancestors was a way of completely exterminating this group. Not only killing them off, but removing their rights to the land, removing their place of centeredness on the earth. They no longer existed.
Amid the ruins of Piquiacta, some say they still hear the solemn prayers of Wari overlords, honoring their mummified hostages. At Chocapuquio, many believe they can hear the anguished cries of mourners grieving at the desecration of their dead. From both sites, we may learn the secret of the mummy's power, for scholars believe that in ancient Peru, it was the dead ancestors and not their living descendants who owned the land. Here, if ancestral remains were destroyed, the living may have lost all rights to their property. And in the harsh world of the Andes, those without property starved. But land was only one fragment of the extraordinary relationship that evolved between the ancient Peruvians and their ancestors. Hundreds of years after the Wari built Piquiacta, they would mysteriously die out, and a remarkable new people, the Incas, would seize control of the Andes. The Incas would create a magnificent civilization and forge an even deeper bond between the living and the dead. Why did the Incas lavish such elaborate ritual on worshipping their dead? No one has yet fathomed all the answers to this puzzling enigma. But clues may be found embedded in the long history of these remarkable people. For centuries, while the powerful Wari ruled Peru, the ancestors of the Incas were an obscure tribe, living alongside other people in the southern Andes. The Wari Empire declined around 1000 AD. Then, in the early 15th century, the Incas galvanized themselves into a fighting force and began their meteoric rise to power. Within a few generations, they forged the largest empire Native America had ever known, an area as large as the Roman Empire. As they contemplate the Incas' extraordinary accomplishment, scholars often wonder how simple Andean farmers could transform themselves into one of antiquity's most powerful nations. It is a question that may never be finally answered, but experts agree that Inca civilization owes an enormous debt to one extraordinary man, an emperor named Pachacuti. In the Inca language, Pachacuti meant either cataclysm or he who transforms the world. It is indeed a fitting name for this towering figure of America's past.
Pachacuti is perhaps the greatest political genius ever produced by the Native American world. He is credited with completely inventing the Inca state and all of its institutions. He sat down and drew up the organizational charts and said, this is the way it's going to be.
Pachacuti's fertile and imaginative mind reshaped virtually every aspect of Inca life, even the way his people venerated their dead. It was Pachacuti who evolved Peruvian ancestor worship beyond anything the Andean world had ever known, by creating the official cult of the royal mummies. He devised a new religion which celebrated the heroic deeds of Inca ancestors, believed to be divine emperors who were children of the sun.
Pachacuti's motivation in organizing the mummy cult was to perpetuate Inca rule. He had to set up a system that legitimized what the Incas were doing. Of course we're conquering the world, we're ruling the world. It is our legitimate right. This is the natural order of things. Our ancestors have foreordained this.
Pachacuti was untroubled by the fact that most of his ancestors' triumphs were more mythological than real. He built magnificent palaces whose walls can still be seen in the ancient Inca capital of Cusco. In these splendid homes, the royal dead were propped up in resplendent luxury, attended by a host of living servants and descendants. Each year, at the great sun festival called Inti Raymi, the imperial mummies were carried in solemn procession around Cusco's central square. It is said that as the mummies passed by, the people bowed and wept, so moved were they by the mere sight of their royal ancestors.
The dead body of the lost Inca was not seen as some useless, non-living object, but was seen as infused with the power, with magical power that flowed through the landscape, that flowed through the sacred trees, the caves that they venerated. And it was necessary to feed and clothe the mummy, to keep it alive, to keep its essence alive, in order for power to flow from the mummy back to the ordinary lives of the people.
In the world of the Incas, the boundary between life and death had ceased to exist. Deceased Inca emperors and other aristocrats still resided in the magnificent palaces they had enjoyed when alive. Their mummified bodies were attired in magnificent finery and adorned with jewels, surrounded by devoted priests and servants who attended to their every need. In solemn reverence, the living carried their dead to public festivals, to social visits with other mummies, or to living relatives, and even to sumptuous banquets where they were offered food and drink. At these bizarre festivities, the living attendants of the mummies ate their meals and drank their toasts, believing that the dead ancestors were also enjoying themselves. Attendants placed large pitchers of corned beer in front of the corpses, offering toasts and good wishes to both the living and the dead. In the imperial mummy cult, the lives of the living became a strange theater of the dead, an acting out of all of life's pleasures and necessities for the holy ones who had never really died.
The royal mummies were seen as living beings, had to be dressed every day, that had to be fed, they had to go to the bathroom, they had to have sex.
Whenever a crisis arose, the living, speaking through priestly interpreters, begged the mummies for their advice. When war erupted, the dead charged into battle side by side with the living.
Por eso que incluso también cuando había algunas expediciones,
When there were military
militares,
expeditions,
se hacían acompañar con las momias.
the mummies of the ancestors
Y las momias
would
de los
go
antepasados
with the armies.
junto con los ejércitos. Y esta parece una práctica.
This seems to have been a common practice in the Andes, because when the city of Cusco was attacked by a group from the north, known as the Chancas, they were also carrying their ancestors, and the Inca victory was won when they were able to carry off the mummies from this group of Chancas.
In more peaceful times, people asked the mummies for permission to plant their fields, to marry, even to engage in business. In the world of the Incas, the dead held the fate of the living in their lifeless hands. The superstitious Incas were convinced that if the ancestors were displeased with them, they would be doomed to suffer disease, ill fortune, and death. They firmly believed that the mummies kept them alive by controlling the forces of nature.
When there was a need for water for the cultivated fields, they usually brought out the emperor's body, carrying it in a procession through the fields, and they were convinced this was largely responsible for bringing rain. Father Bernabe Cobo, 1609.
Mummies also had a role in being able to help people answer questions that were unknowable to humans. They could predict the future. They could help people interpret current events in terms of forecasting what they should do in response to them. They could be asked to intercede with the supernatural and to bring the world back into balance.
Perhaps it is no wonder that, fearing for the future, the Incas willingly served their departed ancestors, in the fervent belief that they would be protected by the all-knowing, all-powerful dead. When Pachacuti decided to enforce the cult of the royal mummies, he cleverly blended practical politics with the age-old reverence that his people held for their ancestors. But he may have unwittingly sown the seeds of his empire's fall. In 1471, the legendary Emperor Pachacuti, creator of the mighty Inca Empire, died. His grieving people prepared their beloved emperor for his new abode among the dead. After removing his internal organs and packing the empty chest cavity with preservative herbs, they carried his body high into the Andes. Among the lofty peaks, the heat of the sun and the cold, dry winds of night soon turned his corpse into a hard, resilient husk. His mummy was dressed and decorated with finery worthy of an emperor, then returned to his palace to begin his sojourn among the living dead. Pachacuti left behind the imperial mummy cult that he had established. But in the years that followed, so much time and effort were devoted to caring for the mummies that the cult severely strained the empire's resources. Yet the elaborate worship of the ancestors continued. Why? The answer lies in the intensely deep and powerful bond that existed between the living Incas and their dead. After Pachacuti died, the cult of the royal ancestors was continued by groups of royal descendants called Panacas, special groups that Pachacuti himself had established to serve the imperial mummies. The Panacas administered the mummies' lands and estates, all of which remained a deceased emperor's property even after death. On the estates, hundreds of laborers worked tirelessly, growing food for banquets and feasts to be attended by the mummies. For the privileged Panaca members, worshipping the dead had its rewards. As the mummies were exposed to the good things in life, so too were their living attendants.
After all, the goods that are produced for the dead are not produced to be wasted. They're produced to be shared. The occasions when people went to feast the dead were also occasions to feast themselves.
But this arrangement between the living and the dead was fatally flawed. Since no one could inherit a dead ruler's property, a new emperor was penniless when he came to the throne. To fill the royal coffers, he had to rely on the spoils of war, won by fighting battles in distant lands. Yet no matter how much wealth was accumulated, vast amounts of the empire's choicest farmland remained the property of the dead. Generations of living Incas continued devoting themselves to raising crops for their ancestors.
They certainly had a lot of costs involved in maintaining this cult, and principally they would do it because they genuinely believed this person was still alive and participating in their society. Therefore, they could not take their material goods away from them. The problem is that in doing so, they removed a tremendous amount of very arable, productive land from the royal economy.
By 1527, half a century after Pachacuti's death, the wealthy Panacas had grown into powerful political factions capable of challenging the emperor's authority. A new emperor named Huascar now ascended the throne. Determined to break the power of the Panacas, Huascar boldly decreed an end to the cult of the mummies.
It is said that one day, becoming angry with these dead people, he said that he was going to have them all buried and was going to take away from them all that they possessed, for the dead had all that was best in his kingdom. Pedro Pizarro.
By the time that the Emperor Huascar came to the throne, he found himself in a situation where he needed to begin to suppress these cults of the mummy because they were controlling way too much of the empire's resources and were very influential in decisions that he thought that he alone as the Sapa Inca should be making. We know very little about the particulars of what he did, but the Spanish accounts record the fact that he alienated large numbers of the nobles of Cusco through this attempt.
Unwilling to accept the loss of the wealth and privilege they enjoyed as servants of the royal ancestors, many of the great lords of Cusco abandoned their allegiance to Huascar. discontent soon split the nation. At the end of a long and bloody civil war between Huáscar and his half-brother Atahualpa, Huáscar was taken prisoner and eventually killed by Atahualpa's forces. Atahualpa declared himself emperor and continued the cult of mummy worship. But Huáscar's body was never mummified. A contemptuous Atahualpa burned it. Huáscar's grim fate had shown what would happen to those who dared to question the ancient authority of the living dead. But within a year, the mighty Inca Empire itself lay in ruin. It is February 1532. After a perilous 800-mile voyage from Panama, the Spanish adventurer Francisco Pizarro lands on the coast of Peru. With him are 168 men, driven by the dream of discovering a fabled land of gold and of seizing its riches for themselves. Facing them are the invincible armies of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, some 200,000 seasoned warriors. At first, the Spaniards are terrified. But they soon discover that the Inca Empire is not as formidable as it seems. Smallpox, a new disease transmitted to Peru from the Spanish settlements in Mexico and Panama, is ravaging the native people, and Atahualpa has seriously underestimated the steely will and ruthless cunning of Francisco Pizarro. Laying a clever ambush, the Spaniards capture Atahualpa and massacre his troops by sword and firearm. The Incas flee in terror. In one of history's most stunning defeats, Pizarro and his small band of men bring the greatest empire in the Americas to its knees. Atahualpa offers Pizarro a king's ransom in gold to spare his life. Pizarro agrees. But as soon as the gold is delivered, Pizarro strangles Atahualpa. Yet Pizarro and his men soon discover that killing a living Inca emperor is not enough. To rule Peru, they must also conquer the dead.
They could not comprehend the influence that a former and dead emperor could have on the living. It was something totally alien to Western thought at the time. So they viewed it as something quite frightening in the sense of perhaps something akin to devil worship.
Some of Pizarro's battle-hardened men were deeply touched by the reverence the Incas displayed toward their ancestors. Spanish chronicles tell of conquistadors who respectfully removed their hats when a procession paraded a royal mummy through Cusco's streets. But the Catholic Church denounced the mummy cult as pagan idolatry, and Spanish authorities soon understood that if they were to truly conquer Peru, they had to eliminate the last remaining challenge to their rule, the powerful spell of the ancestors over the living. It was not long before Peru's Spanish overlords embarked on yet another war, this time against the dead.
So when somebody was willing to reveal where the ancestors were, Then the clergy and their allies would take out the dead, bring them into the village, hang them up on ropes, divest them of their clothing, set them on fire. A dry mummy will go up in just a puff of smoke. And they knew that as long as any material trace continued, people would try to be faithful. So even after the dead had been destroyed by fire, they would gather up the ashes and then send secret messengers to go and dump them into rivers or lakes in faraway places so that not a trace would remain.
As the church ruthlessly burned mummies, it forced the Incas to adopt a strange new ritual which was totally alien to them, the practice of Christian burial.
The Incas were rather perturbed by Christian burial practices. The notion of putting the body into the ground where it could not be fed or cared for or brought to visit its relatives or to participate in ceremonies was totally alien to their way of thought. This was perhaps one might describe a barbarism from their point of view.
Mourners would come back at night to rescue the dead person and try to give them a decent Andean treatment. Well, of course, they had to do that, because for them, burial was a nightmare. They would think of their ancestors as suffocating and perishing from hunger underneath the earth all alone. Another thing they did was to try to gather up the ashes of the ancestors that had been dead and make them into a new kind of ancestor shrine. And there even were special prayers and songs which have been recorded that were sung in honor of these burned fathers.
Flower of fire, residue of fire, eat this, drink this, burned Lord, scorched Lord. You who have the water, you who have the fields, give me water, give me food from where you are, so burned. And in prayer to the ashes of the dead.
In the end, Catholic zeal and Spanish might proved too powerful to resist. Reluctantly, the Incas became Christians. But was the ancient worship of their ancestors forgotten? Every year, Quechua Indians from throughout the Andes flocked to the city of Cusco to celebrate the great religious festival known as Corpus Christi. It is a time to commemorate their ancient culture, which has endured despite the early Spanish efforts to destroy it. At the festival's climax, groups of men carry huge images of the Virgin Mary and Catholic saints from Cusco Cathedral around the city's main plaza. Each effigy weighs more than a ton. It is an echo of ancient times when Inca men carried the mummies of their sacred dead through Cusco to celebrate the great festival of the sun.
What we think the natives are seeing is the old procession of the mummies being carried around the plaza. The saints have simply been substituted as another sacred object that serves the same need. I think they feel a great continuity when they stand there and see this parade of images. They know that that particular aspect of their rite is being taken care of, even though in a Catholic guise, and that the world will continue to be in order.
Por ejemplo, todavía hoy en día se hacen ofrendas para
Today,
los muertos.
there are still offerings to the dead,
ellos, se toca la música que les gusta, se les da la comida.
with visits to the cemeteries and much drinking, feasting, and music.
El Día de los Muertos, por ejemplo, es un día de recuerdo.
The Day of the Dead is a day of sharing with those we know who are still here with us.
The rites of Inca ancestor worship still live on. And strange as it seems, the mummies themselves may someday return. But when they tried to annihilate the cult of the dead, the Spaniards did not burn all the mummies that they found. Several imperial mummies, among them the body of Pachacuti himself, were taken from Cusco to the city of Lima, where they mysteriously disappeared. Perhaps the missing mummies will be found one day. If so, there will surely be much rejoicing high in the Andes. After so many sorrowful years, the beloved ancestors will return to watch over their people, just as they did for untold generations past.